Prime Minister Carney announced more than $1 billion in support for the industry today, but he also faced questions about comments he made about U.S. tariffs yesterday, saying there was little evidence of deals without tariffs.
We are in the midst of long now and tough negotiations with the United States. We will continue to work constructively for a deal, but it has to be a deal that works for Canadians and Canadian workers. And part of the reason why we don't have a deal is that deal is not yet on the table.
Mélanie Joly is the Minister of Industry, and she joins me now. Minister, it's good to see you. Thank you for taking time in a busy day.
It's a pleasure, David. Thank you.
Before we get into the details of the steel announcement today, I'm hoping you can give us a little bit of clarification on something the Prime Minister has said. He said yesterday there's little evidence of any country, any jurisdiction having a trade agreement with the United States without tariffs. And a lot of people are perceiving that as the Prime Minister saying Canada could accept a deal or could sign a deal with some level of tariffs. How should they view that statement?
So, David, I knew you would be asking me that question. Of course, I'm here to talk about the steel announcement today, but my answer will always be the same when it comes to the negotiations with the U.S. We'll let the Prime Minister do his work, which is very complex negotiations, and we won't negotiate in public. And so that would be my answer on all questions related to what's going on with the U.S. on the trade negotiations.
Look, I can appreciate the complexity of it, and I'm not asking this as a gotcha. I'm truly trying to understand, is this a shift in Canada's understanding of the direction of these talks, or is he merely stating fact when he says that nobody to this point has been able to avoid tariffs? I mean, how should we parse it, or do you want to stick with the won't negotiate in public here?
Well, I think it is a fact indeed that there's been a couple of trade deals with tariffs along with the UK, or it was just announced with Indonesia. That's just how the Americans have been negotiating. As for our own situation, our situation is different. There is a pause also on fentanyl related. So the fentanyl executive order that was signed by the president back in February. And so these are active conversations, and they are linked to many, many different parts of our industries. And my job as the industry minister is to be able to support these sectors that are targeted by the U.S. administration. And ultimately, our job as a cabinet and as a government is to make sure that we stand up for Canadians and that we defend Canadian interests. Okay. So I think, what is great about my new job at this point, it's not that new, David. It's really being able to control what we can control, and to be able to have our own destiny in our hands. And so that's why, the work we're doing, for example, on steel, and what the Prime Minister announced today was just not only about protecting our market. It is a pivotal way to make sure that our steel producers that have been for a long time working on supplying the U.S. auto sector are able to offer also products that will be able for our defense procurement, that will be supporting also our major projects. So it's an entire different way of doing business in the country for the steel sector.
Well, just on that, if you look at the breadth and the scope of everything that was on the table in the measures today, dealing with, changing tariff limits for countries with trade agreements, without trade agreements, shifting domestic procurement, the reskilling money, the strategic infrastructure, there is a lot there that essentially amounts to a pathway to restructure the industry, which you can look at it in one of two ways, that this is a sign of support for a core industry, or a sign that the situation with the United States is not going to get better anytime soon. So these measures become necessary. How should we view it?
I think we should view it as the fact that we've been over-dependent on the U.S. for a long, long time, which made us very strong as a country, but we can't even be stronger by relying on our own domestic reality and needs. But I must say, we will continue to do business with the U.S. That's the case every second of this day and every day of the year. But we will also work with new partners, or partners that we have not developed commercial relationship as deep as the US one, including, of course, with Europe and key Asian countries. But, you know, when you think about it, the defense investments we're making are historical, okay? It's the biggest investment since the Second World War. It creates opportunities to have a real defense industrial strategy, which I'm working with, of course, working with the Minister of Defense and key colleagues. But now, while we will be investing in ourselves and investing in our strong men and women, protecting us and protecting our sovereignty and making the world a better place, we need to create jobs. And we need to make sure that every part of the supply chain, including the steel industry, including the aluminum industry, is able to support the defense sector and support our manufacturing sector. So to the fantastic workers in Hamilton, in Sault Ste. Marie, across the country that are working the steel sector, we have your back. And more than that, we will make sure that your career is a great one, because we'll make sure that there are jobs at these steel plants for a long time.
But, you know, as you look to partner with countries other than the United States to reduce the dependency, you talk about key countries in Asia, for example, South Korea, Vietnam, countries that are seen as bad actors by the Steel Association for dumping steel at lower prices into the Canadian market. They're targeted by measures today to reduce their imports to about 50%. There are a lot of Canadian producers, though, who have relied on that cheaper Asian-made steel. There's going to be a knock-on effect in their sectors, isn't there, where prices will go up as they are asked to pivot towards a domestic supply?
So I know there's a concern regarding the price of steel, and that is why we want to make sure that we have very good conversations with transport companies, including freight companies and railways, because we need to make sure that the price of steel makes sense across the country. I saw today the fact that Seaspan, a major shipyard on the Pacific side, has entered into an MOU with Algoma Steel of Sault Ste. Marie. Good news. I was at Irving Shipyard yesterday in Halifax having conversations about how can we support our Canadian steel. We just announced that in the context of a procurement, we would have clauses to make sure that we're supporting our steel sector and aluminum sector, our lumber sector. So it is indeed, we are now in a world where the lots of industries are impacted by the decision by the US government. But I must say, we are really taking the right steps to make sure that we're protecting the jobs, but also we're finding ways to create opportunities and create jobs. And that's why also last Friday, David, I was in contact, well, actually, there was an incoming visit from the European industry minister, which is basically the number 2 of the EU, to make sure that we're coordinating our answer to not only the US, but also when it comes to key sectors, including steel, to make sure that the Canadian companies have access to the EU market and vice versa. So that's why you saw in our answer today a different response for countries we have free trade agreements with and countries we don't have free trade agreements with.
Right. So how did you settle on that 50% of what they'd imported? Why that number? Is that enough? Does that cut enough cheap supply out of the supply chain to force people or incentivize people to pivot to the Canadian companies? Because it does come at a higher cost because of different labor standards and other things. How did you arrive at the numbers you arrived at there?
So when you're an industry minister or any government that looks at the steel industry, we know that the steel industry is a crown jewel for the manufacturing sector. It is fundamental. Steel and aluminum are key to build in a country. And so that is why many countries in the world have invested in their steel sectors and have had a lot of protectionist measures. We have had an open market for steel for a long, long time. Why? Because we knew that we could export also to the US easily, and at the same time, the business was good. Now, because we're so open, we need to be careful for any form of dumping happening at a time where the US is closing down its market. And then there can be, and we were seeing signs of potential dumping from foreign steel coming into our country. And so in that context, we needed to act. We need to make sure that indeed we will make sure at the short term close our market. That's what the Prime Minister announced. middle term, we need to make sure that we're offering companies support to be able to get through this difficult time, because these are difficult times. And at the same time that they can pivot, because long term, what we need to do is to make sure that we're investing in the domestic production of a domestic market linked to major infrastructure projects. That's why we passed the important Bill C5, and also the defense industry and our housing strategy. So it's all linked. It makes sense, but that's why we need to make sure that we were making this important announcement regarding trade barriers today.
Right. I mean, these are protectionist measures designed to protect the industry, essentially from the loss of market access in the United States. I wonder, though, Minister, do these measures stay in place if things get resolved to the U.S. and market access returns to normal? Is this sort of the new way of doing business, or is it simply short and medium-term measures to give the industry the time it needs to restructure?
I think that, we're very pragmatic. I'm a very pragmatic person. You've asked me I've given many interviews to you over the years, and that's usually how I answer things. We will adapt to events. But I think that we are in a world where lots of countries will organize themselves through economic blocks, and that the manufacturing sector will be seen as a key national asset that is key in times where there's more geopolitical tensions and we're living in a much more dangerous world. So we need to make sure that we are keeping our manufacturing capacity, that we're investing in defense, and ultimately that we're keeping our workers able to have a good job. So I see that, when I've said that, the Prime Minister have said that also, that the relationship with the U.S. will be different. Looking ahead, that's also part of the difference that we will see in the coming years.
So one final point on this, Minister, before we let you go. There is no retaliation against the United States here. I'm assuming that is because of the state of the negotiations. You want to give until August 1st. Am I understanding that correctly? And is there a message to President Trump in this that Canada will not be a transshipment route for cheap steel in the protectionist measures you've announced today?
When you hear my different answers throughout the interview, it was mainly all about protecting Canada's industrial capacity, keeping the jobs, making sure that we're investing in the plants across the country. I'll be going to Sault Ste. Marie, I hope, in the coming 2 weeks to meet the workers, to meet the company. I've been in contact also with the CEO of Algoma Steel and also with ArcelorMittal Dofasco. We've been mainly working on keeping the jobs and the industrial capacity here as the U.S. is taking its own decisions. And meanwhile, of course, we'll continue to negotiate, but we won't let people down, and we've said that from the get-go, and that was a key part of our electoral platform. So we're just basically moving ahead.
Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, always appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, David.
Catherine Cobden is the president of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, and she joins me now. Catherine Cobden, good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, David.
What do these measures do today to offset the pain you're feeling because of the United States?
Wow. Well, they provide some relief. Not complete relief, but some relief. And let me explain that. When the U.S. enacted 50% tariffs on the industry on June 4th, they created a devastating situation for the industry where about 6 to 6.5 million tons of steel basically had their market closed. So what today's measures do is give us some room to grow and, it won't be a complete offset, but to build a market for some of that steel that no longer can access the United States market.
Right, so the people who have lost their jobs don't necessarily go back to work because of this. There is reskilling and income support money on the table, but in our interview with the industry minister, Mélanie Joly said essentially the tariffs are bringing in on countries that are not the United States. It's closing the market to give your industry time to sort of restructure and adapt.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly restricting the market. So for For free trade agreement countries, the decision was to set the quota level, if you will, at 2024 level. So as long as they ship the same, they'll, you know, they won't get tariffed.
Don't get around the U.S. tariffs by dumping into Canada.
Correct, and that is a very big fear. And then the non-free trade countries, once they hit 50%, above that, they're hit with a 50% tariff. So it's really in the non-free trade agreement countries where, you know, there's opportunity for Canadian steel. And certainly, you know, we view this as a really critical step, but we also view it as a first step because the market is so dynamic. And when cheaters cheat, we know that they adapt their processes.
Right, so. And that's likely going to happen here. But that 50% that they're opening up there, essentially, of the market for the Canadian producers to move into, how does that compare to the value of what you ship to the U.S.? And do you make the products that go in
so
there?
we're definitely, so first of all, I don't have it on a value basis, but we believe we're looking at about a 2 to 2.5 million ton opportunity. So it doesn't quite hit the 6 million, but it's certainly very helpful. As far as products, whether we make the products or not, we are actively engaged with the government on clarifying absolutely everything we make. I think we have 800 different products that we make, so it's not a small exercise. But there's also a remission process. If indeed there's no way to get this steel, there has to be obviously outlets for the market.
Right.
But if we make it, we're the priority. And I think that is the message that the Canadian government has delivered today, and for that we're very grateful.
Right, so if I'm, say, a construction company, as a hypothetical example, and I need steel to build a building, if I can't get it from Canada, I can get remission if I'm forced to go outside the country. But if I have a Canadian option, I'm incentivized to use it.
And don't forget, sorry to cut you off there, don't forget you can get steel from free trade countries at the equivalent level as last year. So this is not closing the market in a restrictive way. It's taking, you know, if you're a free trader, you're fine. It's and up to last year's levels. But if you're an unfair trader, you are targeted in a deeper way, as you should be. Right. As you should be.
So in the bigger picture, there is a short-term, you know, effect to try to, like, there's $1 billion there to help, you know, buy new equipment and recalibrate your operations to take advantage of the domestic market. There's money there to reskill workers and do income support to keep them there while that transition happens. But it is a transition they're talking about here. This is a large-scale restructuring, it seems, of the steel sector in Canada because of this. I mean, how quickly do you think that is going to happen? Because that feels like a reasonable length of time.
Well, the good news is the tariffs at the border, the different varieties of them, will help in the immediate term. Those are going up, as far as I understand, by the end of this month. So that will help put all of the unfair traders on notice. Canada is closing its market to unfair trade. Then the rest will take time, but at least we have some outlets. This is not a victory lap in the sense that there's still a lot of pain ahead. But we have some breathing room that we just didn't simply have when we woke up yesterday morning, right? So it will take time, and we will undoubtedly have more problems and challenges that we face, but the spirit is there. The other point I want to make is the government on June 19th launched an really intensified working group with the industry and the government departments involved. That process needs to continue because it's through that process that we were able to provide commercially sensitive, detailed information and evidence for today's action. Right. And we don't think it's going to be able to stop here.
Does this put a floor under the job losses right now? I mean, you know, because I know there's about 23,000 people directly employed, you know, in the steel industry, about 100,000 in spin-off. About 1,000 jobs have been lost, give or take, direct.
That's right.
I mean, do any of those people come back? Do none of those people come back yet? Because it feels like this is kind of like emergency room medicine to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we were bleeding out. Certainly, I think the emergency room measures are those ones that help with wage programs and EI programs and that sort of thing. And then the longer term, actually going in and fixing the patient will take more time. But some of those measures are in place already. So we see those border measures, and then we see the commitment and the procurement process. There's a few things we haven't done that we still need to do. One is to take action against U.S. steel that continues to enter our market tariff-free. I understand the government is sensitive to taking a negative, combative approach. For us, this isn't combative. This is just meeting them where they're at.
Yeah.
That's an ongoing conversation.
Do you think that happens August 2nd if there is no
We'll
deal?
see.
Is that your expectation?
That would be
as
our
a sector,
expectation. If we come to August 1st and there is no deal, the retaliatory measures need to go back on for all steel made that's coming to Canada from the United States. It's really difficult for us to accept that it continues to come in here tariff-free, obviously.
Right, so that's one thing they haven't done. As a final point, what are the other things you think the government still needs to do here?
Yeah, and part of this will come up next week when the premiers and the Prime Minister gather, which
right.
Is the idea of fixing our procurement to prioritize domestic supply. I'm talking about steel, but I think this is relevant to many sectors. We should be, in this context, in today's context, and the global restructuring that is happening around, this is around the world, we should be looking at this question very carefully.
That is going to make things arguably more expensive. And I'm not saying this is an attack on Canadian steel or Canadian industry, but dumping cheap steel brings cheaper steel in, and a lot of people have relied on those price points. If we're going to be forced into this era of protectionism, it does seem like we're going to have to adjust to a higher price future.
Yeah, I understand that point. At the same time, do we really want to build our economy on the backs of, poor labor practices, poor trade practices, not on the rule of law? I think Canada should stand, above that fray, and Canadians and businesses should embrace the concept of supporting rules-based trade practices.
Okay.
Yeah.
Catherine Cobden, always appreciate the time.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thank
coming
you
in. It's
very
Catherine
much.
Cobden with the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Okay, so should Canada be lowering its expectations for a trade deal without tariffs? The Power Panel is here to talk about all of this. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Rachel Siegel is a former Director of Policy in the Stephen Harper government and co-host of the Beyond the Ballot podcast. And here with me, she also does a podcast, is Jordan Lakeness, a former NDP strategist. You can hear her on The Curse of Politics. Good to see you all. I don't know, Supriya, where things are with the Canada-U.S. trade talks. The Prime Minister had some comments yesterday, has a lot of people thinking he's laying the groundwork for a deal with tariffs. Today, he sort of said, I'm not going to answer specifics because we're in trade talks. What is your sense of what a big steel package today and those comments yesterday tell us about the state of that negotiation?
Well, I think first off, we'd all probably be better off if we sort of collectively recognized that there is no rhyme or reason to the president's strategy on essentially tariffing the entire world, right? Us included. There was this tweet that was posted back in May, and forgive me, I forget the account, but it said something like, Trump likes tariffs. He likes volatility. He likes being on the phone doing these deals. He likes being the center of attention and hates it when he isn't. That's it. No strategy, nothing to analyze. And I think that that's quite right. Trump is, in effect, a stochastic negotiator insofar as his strategy is random and can't really be predicted with any certainty. If you listen to his own reasoning for implementing so many of these tariffs, it's incredibly contradictory. Sometimes he says it's to protect, American manufacturing or industry. And at other times, he's boasting about all those sweet, sweet tariff Benjamins coming in as revenue. And, for all of his posturing about Canada being this major supplier of fentanyl that ends up in America, he's utterly incorrect. So it's, I think we need to this is going to be a long ride, a bumpy ride. And I can certainly understand the frustration coming from some conservative corners about, well, Carney said he was going to be the guy to do this. But, I would just point out that Prime Minister Carney and the rest of the Liberals are quite correct insofar as, nobody else would necessarily be faring better in the Prime Minister's office if there was another person there. You're dealing with somebody who is fundamentally unpredictable and unreasonable.
Yeah, and Rachel, there's kind of two tacks, right? You've got to deal with the president as best you can on the trade negotiations and then sort of restructure economic and industrial practices in Canada to build resilience to it, because these tariffs, whether Canada can get around it or not, Donald Trump's kind of imposing a consumption tax on the citizens of his country to raise revenue, and it's just rocking the economy. So what do you make of everything that happened today?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's saying that they could do it better, but I do think that Canadians have given Mark Carney a really long leash when it comes to his ability to reposition based on deadlines, some of which he's put forward to Canadians and said, we're going to have an agreement by this date. I remember a couple of weeks ago when we were hearing that an agreement was imminent, and now we're still waiting, hanging on to that August 1st deadline, with many Canadians thinking, is that really going to be the final deadline? We'll have to see. I mean, Mark Carney, to his credit, is a great negotiator when it comes to business deals. And we talked about this throughout the campaign, the difference between negotiating a business proposition and a political positioning for the country. And like you point out, David, you have to do both at the same time when you're the prime minister. And so I think Canadians have done very well in allowing Mark Carney to take the time to negotiate this deal properly. Obviously, yesterday was a bit of a turning point because he's now saying that the tariffs will probably be included, which is different from the proposition he put to Canadians during the federal campaign. But ultimately, how long will Canadians let him continue down this road? What we saw today with him calling this a long process makes me think the Carney government is also getting a bit worried about how Canadians are feeling this is taking longer and longer and longer.
Yeah, I mean, right, Jordan, it's been 79 days, 80 days since the election. I don't know how you negotiate with a person like Donald Trump. I've never had to do anything like this. But certainly the intent of this restructuring of the steel industry, as defined in the measures outlined today, and sort of the somber warnings about this is going to be the long haul, it's not positive vibes, I would suspect.
Yeah, I think we can assume it's not going well. You wouldn't have an announcement like you saw today, and you wouldn't have the preconditioning that you're seeing Prime Minister Carney doing to lower expectations that he himself contributed to driving up, unless they were thinking that a comprehensive deal is not going to be possible. And I think, look, the problem for Prime Minister Carney is that this wasn't exactly what he told Canadians he was going to do. So during the campaign, his rhetoric was very tough against the U.S. It was very clear that he was looking for an agreement that was tariff-free. That was the goal.
Sure.
And so now we've arrived at a place where not only are the negotiations perhaps not going very well, but actually Canada's made a number of really important concessions just to remain at the table. So including recently the digital services tax, but we've also taken a number of measures to do with border security that maybe would not have happened otherwise. And of course, we've held off on retaliatory tariffs a number of times. And so these are all measures that have really just got us to remain at the table. But it looks like the shape of the agreement to come is not going to be what was hoped for. And so the challenge that Prime Minister Carney has is that politically, that's not really what the table was set for. Canadians are still showing a really strong appetite to push back aggressively on the American tariffs. And, you know, and I do think that there is something to be said about Trump's motivation on this. He's pretty clear, like his stated goal is to economically harm Canada. And that hasn't changed. And he's also been very clear that he wants the revenue from this.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, there was a sense perhaps earlier on that you could negotiate with him in a rational manner by dealing with some of these other irritants, but that's just proven to not at all be the case. And so that leaves the Prime Minister in a difficult position here, where I think we may end up with an agreement that's not too divergent from some of the others we've seen struck, including the UK, but that's not exactly what Canadians were hoping for necessarily when he was chosen to do this job.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where the posture is post August 1, if that deadline stands, and if a deal isn't done. But, you know, Supriya, when you pull back and zoom out, Trump is forcing the whole world to give stuff up. Like Europe gave up its DST and abandoned its plans.
UK didn't, though.
The UK didn't, but, you know, it accepted a 10% baseline tariff, and all the NATO countries have agreed to spend 5% of 3.5 and plus 1.5 on. Like, he is basically using the weight of that country to force everyone to do what he wants.
Absolutely he is. And it is somewhat amazing that the whole world hasn't really figured this out yet, right? That he is using the heft of, you know, the U.S. economy to sort of bully everyone else around. And for the vast majority of the folks that have, or the countries that have been negotiating with Trump, it seems that a whole bunch of them are more than willing to sort of kowtow to whatever it is that he's got on deck, and changing the reasoning even for why he's implementing tariffs. I mean, just look at the reasons that he's thrown at Canada for implementing tariffs. It's been everything from migrants and borders to fentanyl to our dairy, supply management, to banks apparently not operating here. Like, he just makes up reason after reason without any real substantive basis for it. So I think all of this, what it really points to is almost like kind of the political malpractice that the Conservatives had on the campaign trail. Because it's amazing to me that they didn't point out that Trump there's an inability to be managed or handled when it comes to him. And it would have made for a very effective attack on the Liberals if they had made that case. But they didn't. So here we are.
Yeah, I mean, there's no threshold of appeasement. That seems obvious right now. But Rachel, August 1st is 3 Fridays from now, like 16, 17 days. If things aren't resolved by then in some fashion, I mean, the posture needs to change. It seems Catherine Cobden says she wants to see the steel tariffs at minimum go back on. Where do you think the government needs to go if the next 2.5 weeks don't get a response and an arrangement that's acceptable?
Well, I think that more than just Catherine wants to see that happen. Like I said earlier, I think that August 1st deadline is really kind of a turning point in this negotiation. I think Canadians are waiting with bated breath to see what behind the scenes negotiations Mark Carney is doing. And, like Jordan pointed out, we've had a lot of concessions. There's been a long leash for Mark Carney on those concessions. But again, will that shorten after August 1st? We're already starting to hear people say, well, we've given this up, but what have we actually won? I think for the government, regardless, they originally were talking a lot about the investment at home. And today's announcement really was about the domestic policy. Whether or not this is signed by August 1st, that I think is going to be the deadline for the Carney government to have to reposition and really focus on putting shovels in the ground, building, working with premiers, and making sure that internally we are having the best deal for Canada, regardless of Donald Trump and his positioning that goes back and forth. I think that for me would be the win for the Carney government, whether or not they'll be able to do that. And we've talked about this at length, the relationship with the premiers and the different provinces having to come on. We've seen MOUs signed between Ontario and Alberta last week, how that will play together. I think that's going to be the uphill battle for the Carney government, regardless of August 1st. Well,
look, it's definitely, Jordan, jolted an internal restructuring of priorities and an embrace of protectionism in response to protectionism. But, it was 30 days ago today the president and the prime minister agreed to a 30-day deadline in Kananaskis. The Monday was supposed to be the retaliation day. Now it's pushed off to August 1st. Excuse me, could be worse. Just your thoughts. We've got about a minute left. Your thoughts on just what has to happen in August if there isn't a deal here? Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's no question that the pressure on Prime Minister Carney to toughen his stance will be significant, and that will come, not just from the public, but specifically from industry, as we've already seen. But the other piece that I think really hasn't been attended to in the way that it needs to be is dealing with Canadian workers who are impacted by this. So we saw some measures today, but they're very small. Just, so they're investing $70 million in the labor market development agreements, but budget last year withheld $400 million from them. So we still have an EI system where 40% of workers can't qualify, and the impacts of the layoffs that we're going to see from the steel industry will resonate out well beyond the workers who are directly employed in that industry. So there is a lot of space here for the government to be moving more urgently on something that was a clear commitment of theirs during the campaign, which is to reform our EI system and make sure that it's actually there for Canadian workers when they need it. Yeah, Hamilton is steel town, but it's got a more broad-based, diversified basis. It's close to Toronto, Sault Ste. Marie. I mean, the mayor there is worried about becoming a post-industrial, almost like a Rust Belt town if this doesn't get resolved. Okay, talks can continue, but we're out of time. So Priya Dwivedi, Rachel Siegel, Jordan Lakens, thank you so much.